Good morning and welcome. This is the Apostle Paul writing to the Corinthians. This is his second letter, and we begin exploring today in chapter 4. He says in verse 1, "Therefore, having this dispensation, according as we were shown mercy, we are not despondent." This sentence indicates how much Paul counted on the Father's mercy. But it also shows how much he's determined to carry, quote, this dispensation to its conclusion no matter what. And he says in verse 2, "But we spurn the hidden things of shame, not walking in craftiness, nor yet adultering the word of God, but by manifestation of the truth, commending ourselves to every man's conscience in God's sight." Paul's an example here to every man's conscience in God's sight. He's standing as an example of that as he perseveres in manifesting the truth, despite the evil that surrounds him. Between these first two verses in chapter 4, we get maybe the first glimpse of what sounds like an embattled apostle who is yet determined to remain faithful to his calling because the one to whom he is playing is the Father himself. It's in his eyes that Paul looks for approval, and the rest of the world can see for itself. In verse 3 he goes on, "Now if our evangel is covered also, it is covered in those who are perishing, in whom the God of this eon blinds the apprehensions of the unbelieving, so that the illumination of the evangel of the glory of Christ, who is the image of the invisible God, does not irradiate them." Great verbiage. Now the if in verse 3, if our evangel is covered, this is a big if. But Paul allows for the possibility that his evangel could be covered, as in covered over, by what follows those who are perishing, meaning those who die never seeing, understanding, or grasping, much less believing the evangel. He says that these are those whom, quote, the God of this eon blinds. Now make no mistake here, there is a God of this eon, with a small g, by the way, a spirit that oversees the eon. It's significant that Paul doesn't name this spirit, and although probably everyone in Christendom would suppose that this is Satan, quote unquote, and that's the name they would put on this spirit, but this is similar to Yeshua's words in John 14:30. You'll remember it. "The chief of the world is coming, and in me it has not anything." I don't want to bog down here in the spiritual hierarchy, but Paul refers to it in Ephesians 6, verse 12, "For it is not ours to wrestle with blood and flesh, but with the sovereignties, with the authorities, with the world mights of this darkness, with the spiritual forces of wickedness among the celestials." So in the midst of your going free in your heart and mind, you don't have to look far to find evidence of what Paul meant in what I just read from Ephesians 6:12. We are surrounded by, quote, spiritual forces of wickedness among the celestials, whose influence is seen everywhere in the world today. Yet you and I can walk as far above it as Paul did. Let everyone around you, I don't mean this in a bad way, just let everyone around you crumble in fear while you remain steadfast, because the only weapons that evil celestials have is deception, lie, distraction, and misdirection. You are believing, as Paul would say. You're not unbelieving, and this is the key to understanding verse 4 in 2 Corinthians chapter 4. Let's read it again. "In whom the God of this eon blinds the apprehensions of the unbelieving." You can't be blinded unless you're already unbelieving, so you have nothing to fear. So let's take care of the rest of verse 4. "So that the illumination of the evangel of the glory of Christ, who is the image of the invisible God, does not irradiate them." That just means that the light can't even reach them, let alone pass through them. People who have already chosen unbelief, or who refuse to believe, however you want to say it, simply cannot see Yeshua the Christ, who, Paul says, is the image of the invisible God. They will not see it, and then they cannot see it. This is just like Pharaoh in ancient Egypt, who, according to the scriptures, hardened his heart. And then also, according to the scriptures, God hardened it. First, Pharaoh would not, then he could not. It's the same idea here. Those who choose not to believe, who decide to turn their eyes from the glory of Christ, become then unable to believe. They've already chosen not to, then they become unable to not only believe, but perceive his glory at all. If they survive to the coming of the Lord, they may be among those left on the earth to be governed by him, whether they like it or not. Perceiving him at that time will not be a matter of faith, like it is for you and me today. In that day, Yeshua will stand before the world. He will be seen, probably on YouTube, by everybody. It's no longer a matter of faith, but sight. Paul knew what he was up against when he wrote all this in 2 Corinthians. Let's move on now to verse 6. For the God who says that out of darkness light shall be shining, it is he who shines in our hearts, with a view to the illumination of the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ. What a great phrase. The Father shines in your heart right now so that the glory of God in the face of Yeshua is something you can see, and you can have the knowledge of it. In verse 7, Paul says, Now we have this treasure in earthen vessels, that the transcendence of the power may be of God and not of us. You know what you and I are reading here? You get a picture of who you are to God, what Christ accomplished for you and is accomplishing now in you, and the expectation we have, Paul said this treasure, we have these treasures in earthen vessels. And all this is to simply make us aware that all this is obviously out of God, not out of us. He says in verse 8, In everything being afflicted but not distressed, perplexed but not despairing, persecuted but not forsaken, cast down but not perishing, always carrying about in the body the deadening of Jesus, that the life also of Jesus may be manifested in our body. Now we can see here again the determination of Paul, always looking to the life of Yeshua in him, despite all opposition, not distressed, despairing, or forsaken, and certainly not perishing, going through whatever he had to demonstrate Yeshua's life even in his own body, but carrying what he calls the deadening of Jesus. Look, we're still human, just as surely as Yeshua was human before he died and did die. We are also dying. We're not escaping that. Our bodies are aging, decaying. That's how dying works. That's what the Father meant when he told Adam, eat that tree over there. To die shall you be dying. It's a process, obviously. Paul must have relied continually on whatever Yeshua intimated to him, as the Lord told Ananias how much Paul must be suffering for his name. So, in whatever ways you may perceive suffering in your life today, remember Yeshua who suffered far more, and Paul who endured far more, and the other apostles who were all martyred for following after Yeshua. Let's jump down now to verse 16. Wherefore we are not despondent, even if our outward man is decaying. Nevertheless, that within us is being renewed day by day. We can see how important your mind and your spirit are, because your outside may have its troubles, but your insides are, quote, being renewed day by day, as Paul says. And then verse 17 reads, For the momentary lightness of our affliction, circle that phrase, is producing for us a transcendently transcendent Aeonian burden of glory. What an incredible phrase, but let me not stop there. Go on to verse 18 for now. At our not noting what is being observed, but what is not being observed. For what is being observed is temporary, yet what is not being observed is Aeonian. Now, you might think Paul was being sarcastic when he wrote this momentary lightness of our affliction, until you read the second part. the transcendently transcendent Aeonian burden of glory that he compares to any affliction we can conceive of. We should remember that in the Apostle Paul's day, persecution was real and often horrible. It's the expectation of a, quote, transcendently transcendent Aeonian burden of glory, an interesting phrase all on its own, that enables us to keep our heads on straight and get through our day. And obviously, it is a little bit sarcastic to say burden of glory, a transcendently transcendent Aeonian burden of glory. I pray I get to carry that every single day. That kind of burden, please let me have it. And finally, Paul concludes chapter 4 in verse 18, at our not noting what is being observed, but what is not being observed. For what is being observed is temporary, yet what is not being observed is Aeonian. Our ability to minimize any current struggle, the momentary lightness of our affliction, if you will, and the reason we can perceive correctly our transcendently Aeonian burden of glory, we aren't paying attention to what we can see or hear all around us, but rather what we cannot see or hear today except by the Spirit and in our spirits. If you'll allow me, this is how I see it. The only way to negotiate this eon and stay sane is to ignore it. Now, that doesn't mean you can't take a walk in the woods or along the beach and have a great time, of course. That's not what I'm talking about. You know what I'm talking about. It's all the stuff that you and I could hear and see around us is temporary anyway, as Paul says, and he's right. What we cannot see with our physical eyes, but which we can see through the eyes of our spirit, is Aeonian. It is lasting throughout the eons of time to come. To me, this is as important and as simple as keeping your gaze vertical toward the heavens, toward the celestial, rather than gazing horizontally at the rest of the world. And if I may, there's nothing here for you in this eon that is not temporary. But there is everything here for you now by the Spirit of God operating in you that inspires you to wait expectantly for the day of the Lord. Your celestial body will not be seen by anyone on earth as far as I can tell, but it awaits that day in perfect health, perfect condition. It never hurts and it cannot die. The best part is you will arrive into that form and meet the Lord face to face. So who cares what happens here on this earth when you have that kind of expectation that the Lord himself won for you? The Father has the rest of the world handled and will bring it to what Paul calls the consummation that we read in 1 Corinthians 15, when God will be all in all. So until then, don't sweat it. Keep your eyes on the prize, to borrow a phrase, and put one foot in front of the other until Yeshua returns. Paying attention to what can be observed, as Paul would say it, is a trap. It's a snare, and none of it lasts. But paying attention to what your eyes can't see, but your spirit knows, and you know by faith, that'll keep you from going down the tubes with the rest of the world. Sometimes the most important part for me to remember all the time, because we don't live in a vacuum. You can't help but see or hear some stuff. The most important thing to me is the sovereignty of God. He is not looking out over the clouds of heaven, wringing his hands, wondering what in the world has happened to his creation. This is playing out exactly as it has to finish up this eon and escort in the new eon. And that's what we wait for. Because in that day, we will all be changed. And that's it for today. So thanks for listening, and until next time, may Yahovah bless you and keep you. May Yahovah light up his face toward you and be gracious to you. May your Father in heaven lift his face to you and appoint peace for you. Amen.